Hi, I'm Lia De Cicco Remu. Welcome. This is Teacher Talk. Hi, everyone. This is episode 11, How to Talk to Teachers, Teacher Talk, a series of webcasts and podcasts where I bring in some really forward-thinking, innovative education leaders to help parents navigate school systems and advocate for their children in partnership with educators. Our topics have included some really important things that are top of mind for parents today, and I'm hoping that the information that we talk about today will help. So we really explored in 2024 some of the foundations that make teaching and learning stellar for kids in Canada. And I wanted to talk to someone who could help us understand where we sit on the world stage. Because, it's a thing. We often complain about our school systems, and things are tough for teachers and for parents, and especially for kids. But I wanted to remind everybody that we're really, really good here. And we sit pretty high up on that chart. We call them the PISA scores around the world. And for more information on that, you can look in our show notes. We sit pretty high up there. So I wanted to talk to somebody from another system who has experience in our system to give us a bit of an overview and a compare-contrast situation where we could go, wait a minute, this is pretty good here in Canada and we're pretty lucky. So I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Ian Esquivel. He's a former TDSB educator now teaching in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, which is way cool. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And it's a junior college school in Switzerland that offers students the opportunity to study the Canadian curriculum abroad. So Ian has taught English, history, media. He was the head of English. He was a curriculum leader for library, moderns in English, a program coordinator for the gifted, a curriculum leader for school initiatives like a VP or guidance counselor, and was an instructor at OISE for media studies. Okay, I would have been in every one of Mr. Esquivel's classes, every single one. So at Neuchâtel, he teaches English, drama, world issues, and is a writer's craft teacher, and also the director of guidance. And currently, he's a guidance counselor and an English teacher. Welcome, Ian. It is just such a blast to see you here today. I couldn't be more happy to be having this little chat with you.
Thanks, Leah. It's good to see you.
Tell us what's going on in Neuchâtel. How did you get to Neuchâtel from the TDSB? Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and why you made that decision?
Sure. So in 2012, I was a colleague of mine who had actually been a mentor of mine. She was had retired from teaching in Toronto, and she was working at my school as a supply teacher. She was there, and I was the head of English there. And she came in and said, I asked how she was doing. She said she's doing well, but she unfortunately wasn't going to be able to come to Neuchâtel that year. And so she all of a sudden said, why don't you go? So coincidentally, the head of school was coming in that weekend. So I interviewed, and then the following September, I came over for my first time. I've come over several times now. This is my fifth or sixth time here. I go back home because I have a partner. My wife's there working. So that's basically how it happened. It's a Canadian school. I teach grade 12 students here. And so the Swiss are, they're careful about who they let in the country for work visa.
Good.
But because it's a Canadian school and I had that expertise, especially English, then it was easy to get me a visa.
Wow. It's just like that. It's interesting sometimes how things happen. You were just meant to go.
Yeah, it feels like that, actually. And I made a lot of friends. The first time over, I made friends here. And I've come back here just on a holiday to see those friends.
That's really important. We know how mental health affects everybody. So it's nice to hear that the transition was smooth for you and you made it like a home after 5 years. How long were you at the TDSB?
So 34 years, just shy of 35. It was a long time.
Okay, so I thought you were around 25, but maybe not, given that you worked in the TDSB. So it's good to hear that you have that very grounded foundation of how education works in Canada. So from your perspective, and I know that it's Canadian curriculum there, but I understand that you have a really good understanding of the Swiss system. And let's just jump back for a second and let our parents know and our viewers know that those PISA scores, those worldwide scores of where countries sit in terms of their education systems. I gave more information about that in the show notes. Both Canada and Switzerland sit very high up there. but there are some differences. And from your perspective, can you share what you think some of those are for parents?
Sure. There are a lot of differences, actually.
Okay.
I mean, in the broader context, you're talking about a country that is, 8.5 million people. It's a very, what people study here is very regulated right across the country. We have cantons here. It's like a province. And in the cantons, there's some control or jurisdiction over what's happening in the schools. But for the most part, everybody follows the same curriculum. And there's 3 streams. Kids go into, we would call it like a junior high school, and then there's a senior high school. When they're young, they go into the junior high school, and by 14, they have to either have made a decision or done some testing to get into one of the streams. And so one stream will lead them into the world of work. One stream will take them into some training, so it's like a college and vocational. And then we'll get into university. And in the past, a lot of students have been going into that middle stream. They get some training. They go on and become, they work in technologies, or they work as a chef or whatever. But there's more and more people who are wanting to go to university. It's very difficult to get into the university stream here. You have to do testing. And there's a lot of, arguably, what there is here is a lot of drilling and rope work, and you have to, that's part of what's going on here. There's not as much room for, individual expression, I would argue. And my friends here who are Swiss, and I just met with a friend last night who teaches in a school in Bern, and her daughters are in the system, and she's Canadian, but she's been living here. It's a much more regulated. And so if you look at things like the arts are much more limited. Once you get out of the, junior panel, there's not going to be as much opportunities unless you, pursue your own training for film, for example. You don't see a huge film industry here. You don't see huge visual arts. There are those people, even writers, there are those people, but they haven't, the educational system's not designed for them. In Switzerland, it's really designed to create workers. And so that it's easier to do when you have 8.5 million people. And the other interesting thing is you have to, I'm in a canton that is French, so everybody speaks French here. I teach in English, but everybody speaks French, and the students are billeted with families that speak French. So canton generally, and the school system, Swiss system, your language of instruction will be French, and then you will have to take one other language. And here most students will learn Swiss German, it's German, but the spoken part of it's very different. And then I was in Bern, my friend teaches in Bern, their language of instruction would be German, and then they would take a second language, so they might take French or Italian. So depending where you go in the country, there is 13% of the country speaks Italian as their first language here. There's about 30% that speak French, and then the rest speak Swiss German. It's what people traditionally think of as Swiss, is what's really Swiss German. So that means you have to be able to speak multiple languages, and most people here are very happy to learn an additional language, especially if it's English. So if you go to, I was in Bern last night, you will hear people speaking Swiss German. You will hear quite a few people who speak Italian, like people who live there, and you'll hear them speaking English. In Neuchâtel, you'll hear French and a lot of Swiss German, and English is increasing, but not as much. So that, I think, is a very different system from what's in Canada. In Canada, can be quite different what's happening province to province. The provinces control the education. So there's some federal intervention or some federal involvement at the university level for sure. And so in here, you'll see, maybe about a third of the students go into, some kind of training. And it's probably higher than that. It's probably closer to 50%. And then you have a third that go into university, and then the rest are in the workforce. That's different in Canada. We've got a significant number that go off to college and do training through college. And then you've got 40% who go to university, something like that. So the outcome, I think, is different here. We, in Canada, 3 times, over 4 times the population, we we create or deliver a lot more engineers and a lot more just people in those professions, but we also deliver a lot more people in the arts. For example, film is a really important part of the Canadian economy, but it's also really important if you're a young person. I have two of my students here this year who want to be filmmakers. They know that they can, if they were in Swiss system, it would be hard for them to do that. What they're going to do is go to schools either in the United States or in Canada, and they'll become filmmakers. That's how it is. So I think there are some key differences. In terms of what PISA looks at, it really is looking at those people who are, and Canada does score well. I think somewhere it's around number 6. There's a set of international testing, and Canada does do well in that, and so does Switzerland. So people are well trained. It's not, it's really looking at sort of math and English proficiency. It's not really looking at things like entrepreneurship and that. So I know I'm talking a lot, but if we bring it back to Canada, a lot of the reason why we need people who are from other countries is because we have to fill those entrepreneurship needs. And entrepreneurship is really how you kind of grow an economy. And it's great for opportunities for young people to get working. And things are changing so fast now that, the idea of going into a traditional discipline in the sciences, for example, what's it going to look like in 4 years? So I think an entrepreneurial spirit is encouraged more in Canada. I feel pretty good about that. And I see evidence of that in my students that I teach here.
You know what, Ian, you've raised so many important points, I'm just trying to keep track of them because it's a lot to unpack. The first one I want to talk about is the streaming, because in Canada, as you know, we've been focused on de-streaming, right? So having everybody together. And I think that speaks to the competency of collaboration and also these humanistic competencies like kindness and compassion and patience and all that stuff that are just as equally important in my mind as these academic competencies as we shift into being a different world. But it sounds like in Switzerland, 14, you got to make a decision on which stream you're going to go into. And that, it sounds like it's working for the economy. So, but in Canada, we're also really focusing on skills competencies now. So there's this real push to get kids into these vocations because we need them, right? So it sounds like we sort of fill in each other's gaps. And if we could sort of have a bit of this and a bit of that, we'd have a really solid system. But it's interesting to hear that there's a lot of kids going into vocations in Switzerland because it's an economic need. And you talked about, the lack of or not the lack of, or the less emphasis on entrepreneurship and creativity, which I really believe in my mind. I think you agree that these are the cornerstones of what's going to get us through this really chaotic, turbulent period of shift and of transformation in our systems. So again, there's an economic component, there's a cultural component, but in terms of just the tactical way of how we are directing our education, it is really different. But I really, really like the thing I like most, because this stuff you can read about on the internet, but I'm glad we're talking about it. And this is something that's come sort of germinating from our conversation, is what PISA is testing. So you're right, Canada sits about 5-6. We're actually declining when it comes to some of our math scores. Switzerland is up there as well. But it's what the test is testing that I find really interesting. So these foundational things like math and English are really important, right? I'm going to put it out there. The machines are here. The machines are going to help with that, right? So the things we have to be looking at in terms of growth is entrepreneurship, is creativity. In your mind, are you seeing any bubbles of that or any thinking towards that in the Swiss system? Because I know in Canada, we do talk about that quite a bit. How do we teach this? How do we assess it is the big question. How do you give creativity a B or an A or a C? What does that look like? How do you assess collaboration? When we talk about those global competencies, is there thinking or is it still sort of like, okay, you're 14, make a decision, go work, go study some more, go to university or get a job? It seems very, and again, it might be cultural, right? Canada, we have this, I find it's a different vibe, right? So what do you think? Is that happening in the Swiss system at all, or is it still?
Yeah, so I think, again, there's, you mentioned several things. First off, let's talk about diversity. So very careful about who they allow to come in. You might have people working and and expats and their kids are in schools here. But in terms of, foreign workers or people who are trained, the Swiss are very small numbers of foreigners come in. They are taken care of. They're trained. They're given language instruction, but then they're giving very specific training to go and fill a gap that's in the workforce. So that's what they're doing here. So diversity does shape for sure education. And, I taught at a big school. I taught in the Toronto District School Board, and I taught in different kinds of schools, adults and younger, grade 9s and 10s, and I even work with some younger kids. And diversity is in Toronto, it's a really integral part of how you move forward. Here they don't have that kind of diversity, so it does make it easier to be able to teach that more regulated or narrow way of moving towards a career, if you will. I also think in terms of here, you're seeing it's very hard for, first off, let's talk about kids when they're 14. So if you've taken that stream and you want to go to the university stream, it's called lycée here in France. If you want to do that, you have to take this test. And my friend Sarah last night was talking about this. There's an oral comprehension test. There's a written comprehension test. There's maths tests. You have to do really, really well in these to get into the lycée. So it's almost gatekeeping so that they can restrict the number of students who get in, to be honest with you. And there's an argument pro and con for that, right? You kind of get the cream of the crop. But at the same time, if what you're testing is to an extent regurgitation of information, yeah, I've learned that stuff really well. And there's my head of school here his kids are in the system from when they were young. He's from Canada. He was a principal out on Vancouver Island. And one of his children, his son, has done well and stayed here. But the young woman, she just found it was a lot of rote learning and repetition and 2 hours of homework every night. And it just didn't appeal to her. So she's actually back in Canada at a boarding school. So, and I bring that up because more and more, there's less satisfaction on the part of the Swiss worker more recently with the fact that they are doing what they're doing. There's a bit of a growing. They don't feel strong enough because they are well taken care of and the salaries are good and all that. They don't feel strong enough that they want to push for that much change because they could. It's a direct democracy here. But at the same time, that's growing because they don't feel like they're getting an opportunity to do what they really want to do. And I guess that brings us back to Canada. There's an argument to be made that, we dropped the ball. I started teaching when it wasn't de-streamed. My first year of teaching wasn't de-streamed. And Bob Ray, that government brought in de-streaming. And I was at a school that was doing an amazing job with auto mechanics, the cooking program. There were people working, to learn how to make clothes. It was a remarkable school. And within 5-6 years, that school was shut down. And so that created, because there was a sense that parents were perceiving those trades as going into the trades as being inferior to going to university. And maybe there was some justification for saying, yeah, maybe we do need to look at who we're streaming into those kinds of things versus becoming engineers, right? And so, but I think what we did was we shut the door, and now it's taking all these years to come back to that. And I've been really happy to see that in the last 20 years in Toronto. It started with sort of more apprenticeships and those kinds of things, which are great because there are more students who wanted to do those things and they weren't getting an opportunity and they really weren't flourishing in the academic towards university stream. And so there's that. And then there's been schisms, which you probably know about very high skills majors. Like those are really important. They're well-rounded programs, and I think they're producing the kind of thinking and skills that we need for, all that entrepreneurial work. And so I feel like Canada is doing, they dropped the ball, but for sure, I think we were catching up with all that stuff. I think it's also regional. High school in Quebec it is so different from high school in Ontario, and Ontario is quite different from high school in Alberta. And I know because I'm teaching kids from all over those places, right? And I get a sense of that. So my overall sense is I think the Swiss system works. I don't think the Swiss system would work if it was as big as Canada, like population-wise, or if it had the diversity. I think there'd be a lot less people who would be happy about it. And I don't know that, you had a prior career in film, and my wife's in film and television. Those are people for whom they needed to do what they need to do. Like my wife would not have thrived. I mean, I can't imagine what she would have done if she wasn't doing what she's doing. And it created a way for her to forge an identity and to do all those wonderful things and apply what are some remarkable skills and knowledge. That wouldn't have happened for her here, I don't think. I'd be surprised if it would have. So I don't know if that kind of addresses what you're talking about. So PISA, what PISA does is great because, you need to have those students, you need to have those skills. You need to have science, you need to have all that, those other kinds of skills. Those are core, but they're only core for a certain sector of the employment market. They're not core for everybody. The other thing I'm going to mention is critical thinking. I think that what really you can't measure so much in any of those tests is critical thinking. That's where the classroom teacher is sort of saying, yeah, I see that critical thinking. And I'm seeing every time I come here, I teach students who are from independent schools, but this year I'm teaching students, the 70% of the students this year are from public schools in Toronto. They've just come here for grade 12 and from across Toronto. From Toronto and a couple from BC and that. And the thinking that I'm seeing in those students from public schools, I think is some of the strongest I've seen in all the years I've taught here. So whatever's happening, and again, there are schools for whom, the kids are not necessarily getting this, and there is this division between kind of the haves and have-nots in a big board, Toronto. There's a bunch of schools that, the kids don't thrive in those schools for sure. But for the students that I'm seeing, they're coming from those high achieving collegiates. They're getting into universities all over the States, and one's got into university, in Europe, and they're getting into all kinds of universities in Canada. One of our students just got into a very difficult program as UBC's science program. She just got in there. So whatever's happening back home, it's really preparing these students to go into these fields.
That's incredible. I think the parents are going to be really happy to hear that good things are happening in our system.
Yeah.
Good things are happening. You're seeing these kids come to Neuchâtel with these varying skills from the public system. I think that's going to make parents feel a little bit better about what's happening in schools in Canada. Again, you are just a wealth of information, Ian. I want to underscore the difference in the systems. You have a monocultural system with a smaller population. So the system there obviously is targeted or has been designed to respond to that need. And so in my mind, it's very tight, it's very clean, it's very clear, it's very directed.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's pros and cons. And in Canada, we have this messy, diverse, mosaic of cultures and stuff that's going on that allows for creativity and allows for, the wonderfulness, the great stuff that comes out of chaos, right? Where there's chaos, there's opportunity. So it's important to note that these differences have been born out of the population and what the economy needs. That's really important. I want to make sure that parents understand that there's good stuff going on here. There's good stuff going on in Switzerland, but there is a difference. And when you look at the PISA score or the marker that we have in terms of what's happening in our systems, what PISA is measuring isn't necessarily what's going to predict outcomes for some kids. Some kids, yes, some kids can take the test and regurgitate and do well and pare back. I talk about that in the book, The Sage on the Stage, right? The teacher's up there, tells you everything, you regurgitate it back, you get that A, you move along. Where's the critical thinking in that? Where's the creativity? All these things that are really, really important. So in the book, that's you've basically given away chapter 3 and 4, my book. So I want to call that out. In the book, I talk about a career calling coach. And I'm wondering if because it sounds like the system does this maybe in a very neat way. So you had a sage on the stage, teacher knows everything, and then the guide on the side where the teacher was more of a facilitator, sort of trying to get the child or listening a little bit more to the child and guiding where the child might go. And then what I'm saying is like, hey, we've got to help kids find their purpose and find their calling, whatever that is. That in my mind, that's what a teacher should be doing. That is the innate joy and the gift of being a teacher. To be able to see that in a child, to me, is a gift. And if we have this technology, especially now in this AI-driven world, that's going to do all the drudgery or the admin, which is the reason I didn't want to teach, because I didn't want to do that. I wanted to sit on the floor and cut and talk to the kids and see who their spirit, get a glimpse at their spirit. So the career calling coach is about getting kids to understand who they are, to connect to themselves, to other, and to humanity. And that's not me. That's Joanne McKecken, the learner first out of New Zealand. So is that happening at all in Switzerland? Because I'm starting to work deeply in some systems and pilot this. And if you read the book, there's an example of what that might look like using technology. In Ontario, it's those learning portfolios. I don't know if you're aware of those learning portfolios. They're empty.
Yeah, no, I know.
So we should be using that to curate evidence of student learning that shows us what they want to do. And there's an example of that in the book. And in terms of skills, I want to highlight chapter 4. They can't all be doctors if they can't spell, right? The global competencies. And that's where I talk about skills. And I give a specific example that I witnessed around someone who was really intelligent, actually had a degree as a teacher, but chose to be in the trades and was treated horribly. But he was a teacher. He never said anything. But that notion of the skills being dirty, of not being white collar, all that stuff, that's going to move out. Because if that's your calling, we need those people. So I'm glad that you highlighted that. That was really, really important. And then the creativity. Full transparency, Ian is married to Adrian Mitchell, who I write about in the book, because Adrian Mitchell is a producer, a very talented Canadian producer. And I worked for Adrian, and that was my first job in the film industry. And I was in my 30s, right? So I never had the opportunity to be validated as an artist, right? I was like, go to school, you get a job, work in a bank, right? That's what I sort of did, work in government, something solid. But when I met Adrian, and I tell the story about that in the book, she was a role model for me to say, you know what, you can be creative, you can do this. And I didn't get that in school, right? So it's those, I think right now, at this time in our history, at this time in the world, that we need those creative thinkers in our systems. We need the Adrian Mitchells, right? We need the people to shine their light, because without creativity, we need these divergent thinkers to get us out of this hole that we're in, right? So shout out to Adrian. Thank you, because you were an incredible force in my life. I don't think I'd be doing this if it wasn't for Adrian. So I want to just underscore and highlight that and tell everybody you're Adrian's husband. And that's how we got you on the show here today. So shout out to you.
My life is Adrian's husband, by the way. I go to, you're Adrian's husband. That's always been the case, just so you know.
I would never do that. You're Ian Esquivel in your own right. And just from listening to you speak, you've done incredible work and made incredible contributions and have had impact in our systems. And there's nothing more important than teachers, I think, in my mind, and nothing more important than our children. And a good teacher gets it. And I shouldn't say gets it, but a good teacher is always working for children and always thinking about how to make the world a better place. That's what we do, right? Let's call it spade a spade. Not everybody's going to love being a teacher, right? And not everybody's going to love being a plumber. That's why the career calling coach is so important to me. Because if you figure that out, and it's not just, oh, you're in grade 10, pick a career, or you're 14, pick a career, but we're curating that information because it's a journey. You're going to land where you're supposed to land. And it shouldn't be so hard, right? If somebody's paying attention and saying, oh, you know what? You're like tigers. Maybe we should look at the animal kingdom, that kind of stuff, and see where that takes you. And that's the fun of being a teacher. So all the stuff that you have mentioned so far, I'm just going, in my brain. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak to the Swiss system about creativity and stuff, I think, and in Canada. So in Canada, we, I think there was a period there, 15 years ago, it probably changed, but where it was important, I think, to get training for kids, to think about employment, to do those kinds of things. It was very, if you taught a certain set of skills and there was a certain kind of knowledge, then a person could become something, and you knew that there was a stable career. So let's just take something like the sciences and engineering. You knew that that was going to be something that was stable and it was good. And I think that it was good to, to sort of direct kids that way. The world's not like that anymore. And so, the sciences right now, who knows where that's going, but there are a lot of people who are taking sciences and then they're not finding decent jobs. Like they wind up stuck as research assistants and stuff. So the things that we knew then, it kind of made sense what we were doing. It doesn't, to me, make sense so much anymore. And maybe that's what the Swiss are encountering. What the Swiss do very well is they take that student, once they, let's say they want to become an auto mechanic or they want to become a chef, they do a really good job of training that person. They give them those opportunities, and you can go sort of the first 4 years of that training, or you can go even further through the government. The government will do that for you. So I think that they do that, but I believe that we need a different kind of. It's a different world, and I think we have to reassess what we're doing in schools. I'm also, even though I feel pretty good about Canadian schools, I'm also critical of Canadian schools because I think that we have not the culture of Canadian schools tends to still be sort of a white middle class culture, except in these pockets in different places. And I don't think, and I've seen this firsthand, we weren't meeting the needs of a variety of kids of color, refugee kids, the 2S LGBTQ plus group community. I taught for years at an alternative school that's mandate. We started a grade 9 program for those kinds of kids. So we did leave behind a lot of those kids. And if they don't get through school, they drop out, then it doesn't matter what you're talking about post-secondary. So I'm seeing some change in that. I watched your diversity, the program on diversity stuff. We have to address that. Here they have to start to address issues of, they're more, especially in Neuchâtel, I've really noticed from when I was here, 11, 12 years ago, there's a lot more kids who have come over from Africa, for example, and places like that. So I'm now seeing all kinds of groups of young kids together who are mixed, which is really nice. But I think that what it means then is that the classroom is going to have to start to somehow reflect who those kids are culturally. And that's what I think has happened in Canada. I look at, for example, the growth of understanding around Indigenous peoples right across the country. All the students here are well-versed that I'm teaching now. They all are very well-versed around those communities. They know a lot, which I think is really important. And that will open the way for those students, Indigenous students, to be more comfortable in our schools and to do better. When I was teaching for my first 20 years, Indigenous students never succeeded. They were in bad shape because we didn't know what we were doing, and they didn't feel any connection. And why would they? So as the Swiss are very, their place in Europe even is like very guarded. We are not going to give up these things that we are. If you read about recent negotiations with the EU and that. So I don't know how long that can continue, but they've done a good job so far. But it is internal looking, in my opinion, and my Swiss friends agree. We're not that in Canada. I think we're much more external looking, and that makes a huge difference. It's so important to have, we need immigrants in our population, in our workforce. Maybe we need to be careful how many, but we definitely need to have those peoples, and that means we need to figure out ways to make them feel like they are, that their identities are respected and represented somehow. I love living in Toronto for that reason. I love living here because it's kind of simpler in many ways. Things are much more black and white. But if you want to be, creative or an artist here, you can do it. You're just not necessarily going to go through the school system and get what you need. You're going to have to find other ways to do it. So my school is a small school. Just across the road, there's a big technical school, one aspect of which is a very significant music program. And, every day, the train stations are here too. Every day I see people with their stringed instruments strapped on their backs. And so, but they're doing that on their own. They're paying for that on their own for the most part. The arts is important to the Swiss. There's always cultural expression here. You can have Avishai Cohen will play a small club here of 200 people where he would be thousands of people in Toronto because people appreciate those kinds of cultural artifacts. So it's not like it doesn't exist here. It's just that it's separate from the notion of education and employment, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, it sounds like a tangent.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like, I think there's lessons to be learned on both sides, right?
Sure.
Canada can work toward being a little bit more crisp in terms of how we're directing and supporting students into their callings, as I call it. Maybe the Swiss could be a little less rigid, a little bit more open, because the world is melting in my mind, right? So it's going to be really tough to be part of a community that is so blended if you're internal, as you say. So I'm glad that we have this perspective, because it's important, I think, for our viewers, because we have viewers from Canada, we have viewers from other countries as well, to understand that Canada and Switzerland are sort of like use cases or examples, but this could be happening all over the world. And what is education going to look like for our kids? Because you said it, and I talk about it in the book, and we all know this: the world is not the same. The world is very different. So we're trying the education, all of our systems are crumbling, right? So we're trying to figure out, okay, what's next now, right? That's where we're at. It literally is what's next now.
Well,
so
AI,
it's important.
So I was to say AI is so foregrounded now. For the first time ever, I have a couple of students who say, "Oh yeah, I want my career to be connected to AI." Right? I mean, that's quite remarkable. And yesterday, a student was talking to me about this new Willow chip that Google has developed. The pace of computing is so rapid in that. So yeah, I mean, you might plan to go off to university and start in this program, but by the end of it, what are you going to need? Skills will you need, right?
Yeah. So I don't know if you've seen the episode with Professor Corrine Housington. She's a professor out of Virginia in the States, and she's focusing a lot on AI. And she brought up a slide during our talk that with the 10 top jobs, and before it's doctor, lawyer, all that good stuff, nowhere to be seen. The jobs that are coming and the jobs that are here and the skills necessary to have those jobs, we're not necessarily teaching them just yet. So that's going to be a bit of a gap, right? So your student is pretty much on the ball, because AI it already is, but even more so, it's going to be very disruptive in terms of our whole lives, right? And I know this because I have a husband who's on the cusp of all of this, doing a lot of work, innovative work with AI and cybersecurity. So I hear all this stuff, and I'm glad that I get to hear, because it really helps me with this work. Like, okay, how can I apply this to education? So if AI is going to be doing all your writing, all your math, and teachers cringe, and we all cringe and say, where's the creativity in that if AI is going to do it? And I talk about, and I in the book, I talk about this as well. I asked my daughter, what do you think about AI? And she said it beautifully. She said, Mommy, AI has no soul. AI has no soul.
Yeah,
so we're still going to be working alongside AI, but what is school going to look like, and what is teaching going to look like with AI? I come back to creativity. So it's incredible that we're talking. We're creators, right?
We have on that note, we have two. So I'm old. Let's face it, right? And I'm
not old.
No, well, but I did retire after a long career, just because I thought, I can learn some new stuff, but I'm kind of not into that anymore. I've done what I did. I taught media for years. I went through all that stuff, and I learned all that stuff, but now I don't really particularly want to. There are two teachers here who are so excited by AI, and they are, they're, one of them is under 30, one's just over 30. My, deputy head of school, who's probably early 40s, her background, she has a computer background and an English literature background. That's her. And she's excited by this. And we're using new technologies at the school. So I do think, so if we think about what we really need to do, is we need to get those teachers with the right kinds of tools. But more important, it has to be ongoing. In Toronto, I had to pay for my own, if I wanted to do additional qualifications, which I did, I paid for it myself. And I think you can't, if you want teachers to be on top of stuff and things are moving so rapidly, you need to provide ways to do that. And the budgets have been cut. The budgets were so severely cut. And, so if you do this, you're not doing this in my board. And so we saw, and that's going to affect the kids as well. And so, and the schisms will be one way for that to happen. I was at a big school before I moved to the smaller school in Toronto, and they were doing a great work around cyber arts and all those things. They have a robotics program, all that stuff. And it was equal for young women and men, which was really great, I think, as well. Maybe here in Switzerland, things are a little more streamed around gender lines. It's quite traditional in terms of, what's the expectation here, for example. So all of that stuff around creativity can look different from the notion of just the arts. Creativity through, AI is going to be thinking a certain kind of way, thinking outside the box. So How do we do that, especially with budget constraints?
Yeah, well, that's you've pretty much spelled out the guts of where we are right now in terms of shifts. From my experience in the boards that I work with here in Canada, some of them have, as Kareem called it, locked and blocked it because they just don't know, so they're not letting kids use it. Because I think she said 96% of middle school kids are using AI. Like, it's outrageous, right?
Yeah.
And they're smart because you can pump out something in AI and you could tell that AI has written it, but these kids are saying, do it in the voice of a 12-year-old. So it's like, it's bizarre. So what are we looking at? The questions that they're asking. That becomes interesting. The synthesis of the information that the AI is giving them. So they're higher order thinking skills, which I think is really cool, which is what we want, right? We want these creative, engaged, contributing citizens. And that doesn't mean I know how to make widgets, right? Can the machines make the widgets? And then we could get onto the business of being these higher order, creative thinking, contributive, compassionate beings. That's what I'm going for.
Well,
I
and
hope everyone
people
else
all of a
is
sudden
too.
want to move beyond, this is how you do it. I'll do an example of drumming. So, I'm a drummer. I play.
I know that you're a musician, so I was going to say, maybe you do music now.
Yeah. And so in the last, I've seen so many changes in how we record and how we do these things, but I've also seen changes in young drummers. So used to be, you learned how to drum by drumming and maybe you had a drum teacher. Now so many young people can go online, they can see how to do it, and they're so good. And in my opinion, they get good by copying, which is what you're doing with AI in a way. They get good by doing that, but then they all, the really effective ones, they add their own thing to it. They find new ways. That's the creative end of those. I think that's going to be the same with the AI and all that stuff. They will use these tools and they will replicate. It'll all look the same and sound the same, except for those people who go, wait a second, what if I, so I think there's lots of potential. I mean, I'm scared by AI for sure. And I think teachers should really be scared by AI because they're going to have to get really good or else AI is going to do the work for them, which makes sense. And governments will lean towards getting rid of teachers because of salaries and having to cover their medical expenses and stuff. But I think we're smart enough to know in Toronto, I think, that we still need kids really like people and they want to have a teacher at the front of the room. AI is not going to help them when they come in the room and they're angry and whatever because they had a fight with their parents or they were up all night because their neighbor is screaming or something like that. And AI is not going to solve that problem. And kids know it, right? But it's going to solve a lot of other problems for us.
I saw a really interesting quote, and I'm sure people have seen it. It's not AI that's going to take your job. It's the person who knows how to use AI that's going to take your job. So I think the role of the teacher, that's why I call it in the book, the role of the teacher is to change. You have to become more of this compassionate caregiver, helping direct, offering counseling almost. I say you have to become part counselor. I think good teachers are part counselors anyway, but more so because the information that teachers were valued for in the past, i.e. the knowledge you could get from AI, doesn't mean it's correct though. So let's be really careful around the data. You got to check it, right? It's not going to be, you don't know what it's pulling from or where it's pulling from. So that is also a skill, a critical thinking skill that kids need to learn. But you're right. It is going to change a lot of jobs, not just teaching. And I'm glad to hear that the Swiss are thinking about this, the Canadians are thinking about this, and the world has to think about it. It's not a problem or a challenge or an issue or a transition for one country. It's a global thing. And I think we need to learn from each other, even if one system is monocultural and one system is rooted in multiculturalism or diversity. I think some of the challenges or some of the things we have to work through are the same, right? I think what is interesting about Neuchâtel and the experience that you've had is that you've seen a different culture and a different way to do things. So now you have a bigger launch pad or a bigger or underpinning of how to reflect on what's good, what is it, what can I do, how's this going to change the way I teach, or what is my approach going to be? Because you're a soulful person. You're asking these questions because you want to do what's best for the kids. Because we're like the midwives in all of this. We're trying to birth this new thing. We understand the old. We're trying to embrace the new. We're sort of in the middle and try to help with the shift with the kids. So we have to have this big perspective. So I applaud you and thank you for going out to Switzerland and seeing these differences and bringing this information back to us.
Yeah. And
Not every parent can afford to send their kids to Switzerland,
no,
right?
but
There's an equity thing here.
if we speak about, yeah, for sure there is. But that's why I mentioned that so many are from the public system. And there are, in the past, I've taught more kids are coming from who are very rich families. What I'm seeing here is a lot more families that are, they're two professional parents and they've decided to make sacrifices so their kids can come over here. Again, it's going to be only a certain sector, but that sector is in the collegiates in Toronto, for example. But the other thing I wanted to mention was the students that are here. I think that why they're here is to get a sense of other cultures. We do a lot of travel through, so we tie the travel to our curricula. So when I went to Munich to Dachau, I was teaching Holocaust studies and that. So I think that what the students are also getting, and there's quite a few Canadian schools over in Europe, right? And I think that they're getting that sense of, oh, the world's not quite what I thought it was when I was looking at it from Canada. I think that that's important. I think the other part is that I just want to mention briefly that if you are in the military, Canadian military, and you're stationed over in Europe, you get to choose a school and the government will pay for the schooling of your child. So we have 5 or 6 military students every year. And so in terms of my sense of them and their parents is how open-minded and broad they are, because they've been in Europe and some have been placed all kinds of places as well as Europe, right? And so for me, it's encouraging because they bring those insights and that perspective into the classroom with these other kids who are already going, wow, things are different here. And now they're seeing another lens through their fellow Canadians who have not been living in Canada very much. They've been moving around with their parents. So, I think, so out of that, I guess one of the things I think is if there's opportunities for travel, I think schools should start to think about finding more and more ways to get kids to be able to travel. When I was in high school, there was a trip every year to somewhere in Europe. It wasn't that expensive. They found ways to subsidize it. This school offers about 7 major subsidies. So kids who wouldn't normally be able to afford to come here can come here. So I do think that just being in another culture, even if you went from Toronto to Vancouver, right? I think those kinds of things are really important. A friend of mine organized trips to go see Indigenous communities up north from Toronto. Do that. I think that's a great way to enlarge people's thinking for sure.
I think that's really cool. It's a beautiful way to close. Because from what you're saying, I'm sort of processing in terms of what I would love to see is to really get kids out of that building.
That's right.
Out of the building.
I agree.
School, the world is school. School is not the world. I think we've got it flipped. So any opportunity to get kids out of that building, I think is incredible. And it doesn't have to be Neuchâtel, Switzerland, because not everybody's going to be able to afford Neuchâtel, Switzerland or any kind of travel.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I had the honor to do when I was working in a big tech company was to connect countries to work on projects together. So in 1 year, we connected Canada with Vietnam and Korea to do a big project. So the kids, even though they weren't physically able to go there, they still had the experience of working on a global project with their peers from another country. So even if you can't get out of the building, technology can be that enabler to get you out of,
for sure,
so to speak. So I think that if we had some sort of a system in place where that could be seamless, and we have the technology now, but there's ways that teachers from different countries could connect and meet one another and create community. I think that would really be great for the kids too, because we do have to keep an eye on our lens with equity and see these are incredible experiences for kids, but not all kids are going to have them. I think the point is, no matter how you do it, whether it's with technology or a day trip to a community outside of the school, it's important for kids to get out of the school, because the problem is, and help me out here, let me know what you think, there is such a huge disconnect with what we're teaching kids in school and what's happening outside. We're always 10 years late in our systems. So kids are doing it on their own. Kids are using and figuring out AI on their own. And we're trying to play catch up, and we're trying to teach the teachers and give them the support and give them the tools. And we got to get better at that.
I agree with you. I think, sitting in a classroom, 4 walls in a classroom. How outmoded is that? You know, and it's all those things, like you said. And I think I've always worked at schools or worked in a school that I found a way for the kids to have that opportunity. I do think, and it's an equalizer. You're talking about diversity. You know, it's totally, you go into a camp experience through a school, that kid is not doing great in your English class, that he maybe is, or she is maybe doing wonderful things in a camp. So, so I think diversity can be met through that as well. And I agree with you. There are all kinds of kids for whom their home situations are just interfere with them being able to fit into the box of the school. They need flexibility, right? Maybe they are taking care of their sisters and brothers at home. I taught a lot of those kids, you know, and they come to school exhausted and everything. What are they getting out of a classroom experience, right? So.
I taught those kids too, and you're right. So they're you know, we're working on the equalizer. We're working on trying to get kids out of the system because we know learning does not happen just in school. And Edwin Pericles agrees. He's just walked in and made an appearance. That's and he good. Barked. So he's with us on this one. Yeah, I think that we're on the same page. I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's these conversations that are really going to spark change. It's these on the ground conversations and this thinking that I know have to become action. And if we're part of that, again, even having a talk about it and it sparks something in someone who's hearing about it, let's do something about it. I think there's this movement towards that. Because at the heart of everything for people like us, and it should be for everybody, is the kids, right? It's all about the kids.
And the teachers here, the students understand that the teachers are what you're talking about. They care for them. It's easier in a smaller school, but they are nurturing them in different kinds of ways, intellectually, emotionally, socially. And it's easier to do in a school like this. But at the same time, the good teachers I know in Toronto, and that's a lot of them, that's what they did. They found a way for that classroom to become a space where they could be exploring in a way.
Yeah, you know, I've worked with innovative educators across Canada and the world, and I could relate to this because it happened to me. Those innovators, those high flyers, we call them the early adopters, and they're trying these systems. They get in trouble.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, that's why I worked.
So it's tough.
I did a lot of that work in an alternative system. There were schools. I was part of a network of schools in Toronto, and we had lots of flexibility to work with the kid in front of us rather than the curriculum that was in front of us.
And that's it. Mr. Ian Fogarty said that I just did a film. I'm still a filmmaker called Sending Light, and it's just funded by the NFB, the National Film Board of Canada, and it's an exemplar, teaching exemplar of how to teach the Sustainable Development Goals. So I worked with a teacher, Mr. Ian Fogarty from New Brunswick, and he said, we need to teach kids, not curriculum. So thank you for that. I think that's a nice way to close. We need to teach kids, not curriculum, and these kids are different, and they're teaching us, and we can help guide them, and our job is to keep them safe and give them the environment where they will soar, be their best selves, shine, and contribute to humanity.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Mr. Esquivel. It was such a pleasure to see you, to connect with you, to have this conversation with you.
Right.
I learned a lot. I hope to see you and Adrian in Toronto sometime soon.
Yeah, we can get our dogs together.
Yes, absolutely. That would be lovely.
I'm good.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks a lot.
Be well.